Hi, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Apartment Academy, the multifamily industry's only operations-focused podcast and your institute for higher NOI. I'm your host, the Dean of the Apartment Academy here in these hallowed halls of multifamily education, Daniel Cunningham. And today's guest lecturer is Mark Cukro from Plus One Consulting. Mark, as president of Plus One Consulting, has been spending 19 years focused on the maintenance side of our business. And in a very short amount of time, we talked about a lot of key things that are really crucial to retaining, attracting, motivating a maintenance team. I think it's a great episode. You're going to get a lot out of it. Here is Professor Cukro. Professor Cukro, welcome to the Apartment Academy. Thank you for guest lecturing today. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Mark, you're president of Plus One Consulting, which is a firm that provides, generally speaking, maintenance-focused consulting to the multifamily industry. Let's just start out by talking a little bit about your background, how you ended up founding Plus One Consulting. Where did you start in this industry? And let's share a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, prior to this industry, I was a contractor and an HVAC contractor. I moved to North Carolina, and I was new in the city, and I got a job, probably like many people, just trying to pay the bills and have a place to stay and a job I enjoy. And I wound up meeting someone at an apartment community, and they said, we're looking for help. And I said to myself, well, this might be an opportunity. So I started off as a groundskeeper, technician, and then I quickly moved my way up to to the highest level of technician in the company, supervisor, and then I eventually took on a regional and then national director of service team development for Cornerstone and Colonial Properties. And at that time, I outside of the industry, I'd been a public speaker mostly for business and service culture, and so people kept saying, you really should just start your own company someday. And I basically took everyone else's own advice. I was at a good point in my life and my career, and I went home and I spoke to my wife. And if you know me, I'm a very competitive, achievement-oriented person. And she said, if you don't start your own company, you'll never let yourself live it down. And so I took a leap of faith. I started my company, and this is my 19th year, specifically focusing on maintenance, service culture, and the training and service operations. So that is absolutely 100% my focus and niche.
Very cool. Hard to find folks so deeply ensconced in the maintenance side of the industry as you. So that's amazing. What prompts people to hire Plus One Consulting? What are they looking for that they come to you?
So most companies, number one, if they haven't, there's two reasons. Usually people just want to improve and they're eager and they're proactive and they want someone to come in and give a third-party perspective that's neutral and objective. And then the other one is they have so much pain in a certain area that they want to address the pain points. And typically those are similar, and those few points are most often the same. And so that's usually what generates it. And then after I either consult or speak at a conference, it usually leads to referrals.
Well, when I was on the operations side, I certainly could have used some advice from somebody like you. When I started a property management company here in Los Angeles, I did not have the luxury of a perspective of somebody who'd spent 19 years thinking about maintenance. And there were a number of things that we typically bumped into that were problematic, that we had inelegant solutions for. And I thought maybe we'd just kind of do a little speed round some of the best practices that you share with folks that are operating properties that relate to maintenance. Starting with, for example, one of the things that really plagued us was how to handle folks that service team members that were on call, and then how they got compensated when there was an actual after-hours service, like a lockout or something to take care of. What do you suggest for the best practices handling the after-hours service?
So the best practices for that, I'll address lockouts, and then the second part of that question is to have a policy and really understand what liabilities you have before you send people after hours in the dark, maybe in an unusual or tense circumstance, to open a door and make sure that they understand who actually lives there and who's allowed to have access. Just because you're familiar with a person on site going into a certain home frequently, that doesn't mean they're on the lease. And you don't want to have someone walk into a domestic dispute or something like that. So have a policy, stick by it, and you don't always have to give in to the demands of the resident. You really have to make sure that you have everything in documented, you have a process, and everybody knows what it is. If you expect someone at 2 in the morning to be able to find someone on the lease to verify whether they should let them in, that's a little concerning to me. So I would draw the line and make sure that you enforce that for everybody across the board and don't make any exceptions whatsoever. And the second part of that, on call, and I'm starting to see this trend a lot, is people that are on call are getting paid to be on call, whether or not they respond. And what happens, and I think this is a mistake which led to this, is companies would dissect the minutes that someone was there after hours on a property. And so they would spend 20 minutes on site. And now what companies are doing with great success is you have a minimum of $100 or $200 per week that you're on call, whether you get called or not. And then you have a minimum overtime period. So you're not getting paid for 7 minutes of on-call time because you have to get up, leave, go home, back and forth. And so that travel time is also being considered into that. So I would start there and make sure that people are eager to respond to something on call, and they know that you at least care about their time and you're doing the best you can.
So you're suggesting that's a flat rate for being on call, and then you're tracking time that they're there, or the flat rate covers up to 2-3 hours worth of work?
So two things. I would pay a flat fee and then pay them for their time. So the flat fee can't cover time, especially if you're an hourly employee, in pretty much everywhere that I know of. And you'd have to look into that in your local area. But for example, there's a company in Florida. They pay every technician $200 when you're on call, no matter what. And the shortest time you'll get paid on call is 1 hour. So if you go on to you reply to a call for 15 minutes, you're getting paid for an hour. And if you caution on the side of overcompensation, it's much better, and it has a lot less liability in it than if you try to undercompensate people. And so I think that's a good practice.
Cool. I like that idea a lot. Let me go back to the your suggestion that it's really important that before somebody performs an after-hours service, that they know who's on the lease, that they know the kind of situation they're walking into, et cetera, because that can be tense. How do you provide that visibility? Like, what's the best way to ensure that technicians are aware of those things before they go out and respond to a late-night service call?
So, I think being able to read the room, measure the circumstances of what you're walking into on site is very difficult, because they typically have on-call centers, or there's a third-party company that is, so they don't have direct numbers and access to the technicians. So screening that can be difficult, but I would like to say this too about on-call. Like, for example, if there's no AC, it's 100 degrees outside and the people want someone right now. Do you really want a technician in the dark working behind a building underneath someone else's bedroom window trying to give another resident air conditioning? That could lead to a lot of potential disasters you just don't even consider. So I think my approach is to have what I call a good faith response, which is try to assess the situation as best as you can. If not, when you arrive on site, be cautious, and if there's any tension going on and you need law enforcement, call them. If you're uncertain, don't go in. But at least knock on the door and say, we're here. Maybe it is a circuit breaker inside. Maybe it is a thermostat. But it's against our policy to work outside in the dark between 2 bushes and 2 AC units under possibly someone else's bedroom window where their children are sleeping. And oftentimes managers, they just don't think of that. They just want the problem to go away, like we all do. And those are the liabilities, I think, that can cost people their lives.
Great advice. Great advice. Is there technology involved here that you feel is critical to ensure that the service teams have the information they need? Or is access to the PMS system typically, does that suffice?
I think technology, there's a couple things. Technology should enhance your experience with information, not replace your judgment or skill set. So there's a lot of mobile platforms now where you can get information. But it even comes down to the screening part when whoever's answering the phone call or taking that initial response or request from the resident. A resident's not going to tell you, I'm in the middle of a fight with my significant other. It's a hostile situation and I want you to come here. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I think it's very rare. So I don't think there's any technology that could help that part. But there is what's called loan technician software applications. Whereas if you're a technician, you have your phone in your hand, you just hold your thumb on the button, and if you let go for more than 15 minutes, then emergency services are dispatched to that location, and it's tracked by GPS. So there are some things that you can do to help technicians, but nothing will replace it 100%. But we should get as close to that as possible.
That's pretty cool. I like that idea. I've never heard of that before. That requires folks to have a device, obviously. One of the other questions I had for you is device policies for maintenance technicians. Still seems to be a subject not settled. What are you seeing out there? What do you suggest, Mark?
So here's my basic question. Is it required? If the answer is yes, compensation needs to be in place. My next question is for anyone that's not sure, if the perfect candidate came to a job interview and you thought to yourself, this person is amazing, and right before the end of the interview they said, by the way, I don't have a cell phone. I live paycheck to paycheck. I just don't have one. Would you hire that person? And how would you compensate them? So if it is used for work, it is a tool or piece of equipment. Now, whether you compensate them partially, totally, that's up to you. But I do think something should be put in place where they are at least partially compensated, since it's a requirement at work.
And what have you seen, if you had to sort of judge between or estimate between those companies that have we will reimburse you for your device policy versus those like we provide the device and you give it back to us on your last day? Like, how are companies split on those two, between those two approaches?
Some companies like to, it's almost 50-50. Some companies like to provide the equipment, but the thing is if it's not the person's equipment, people in general tend not to take care of things that aren't their own, as well as if it is their own. But if you have a flat fee for on-call and you say, by the way, this covers your compensation for your cell phone, and however much or little you would use that, then you're covered with that. So that could be part of it in the policy. Is because we know you're on your cell phone and you're required to have one, we are compensating you for being on call, and out of that fee on call is also compensation for your cell phone services.
Got it. And do you consult with companies on how to handle personal identifiable information that might be on those phones, a process for handling that, or a best practice? Because I know that's coming to the forefront as well.
I do, and I think that's where, if you can have the ability to compensate someone for using their own phone, they're comfortable having all their personal information on it. All they have to do is put apps on it and access it. It's password protected. They put everything on their own phone. And now, there are gray areas, of course, in everything. My recommendation would be to compensate the person for the usage of their phone. It's already theirs. It's under their name. All their information is already on it. It's their password protected. Your IT department doesn't have to worry about it. And you can also include something as a requirement for like insurance on their phone, which is not much per month covered in that flat fee. So I think those could make up for quite a bit.
Got it. Cool. Another question for you. That's something that's unfortunately becoming more important, which is the possible exposure to fentanyl during unit turns. A very small amount of that, as you know, I'm sure, can be deadly and has resulted in deaths in some areas of the country. You talked about having policies surrounding safety earlier. Is there a policy? Like, are there some best practices people need to be considering now as we enter this age of this extremely deadly drug becoming more common?
Yeah, I think the best policy for that is similar to the bloodborne pathogen. Just treat everything as if it's contaminated until you know it's not. Now, there have been instances where people will put things on homes, on surfaces, countertops. They will put flyers on your windshield under the wipers, and then you touch it, and now you've absorbed chemicals. So anytime you're doing something like that, especially in the turn process, and you may be perceived as a nuisance until it avoids an accident, but I would definitely require people to wear PPE and be a little annoyed at it in the beginning until it becomes a routine behavior. Because And anyone that's watching this, if you're in the multifamily industry, there is no shortage of crazy stories, bizarre occurrences, and things. We put our heart and soul into planning for every circumstance we can think of, and we're still surprised on a daily basis. But at least be ahead of the curve and prevent it before it happens, and don't wait for the loss of a life or a tragedy to change. Try to change ahead of those.
Truer words were never spoken, Mark. This is an industry where you eventually you see it all. And the larger company you work for, the more craziness is happening on any given day. So great. I appreciate your insight on all those things. I want to shift to what is probably most at the forefront of people's minds these days in terms of when they think about their maintenance and operations teams. And that is the dearth of folks that are coming into the business. How hard it is to find qualified technicians, reliable staff on the service side, and then the struggle in retaining them, since there's so much competition. So let's talk a little bit about what you've seen there, Mark. Starting on the recruiting side, what are people doing these days to find and source maintenance technicians?
So what's becoming increasingly common is supervisors are making as much, if not more, than managers, and you'll start to see that. And we have to stop thinking that one position has to be paid more than another. It really depends on the property and the skill sets and what the asset type is, what the exposures are to the person. And so I would start there. And then also, I'll give you an example. I just did a seminar in Pennsylvania last week, and there was 100 technicians in the room, and there was management had one table, and it was a great opportunity. And I said, how many of you are under the age of 30? Three hands went up in the room. Three. It's okay. Well, that in essence is one of the main issues with our industry. And so if you look at the baby boomer generation, it's the second largest generation, and then millennials is next and larger than them. And then there's about 25 million people less in Generation X. And during Generation X being raised, that's when all the trade schools started to be eliminated from our educational systems. It's very rare that you'll find that now. So the baseline skill set is remarkably different and lower, to the point where you have to teach what tools are, what types of screws you can use and can't use. And so the idea of people showing up knowing what they're supposed to do and having the basic background and skill sets no longer exists. So we have to, it's like, I'll give you an example. I say this all the time. Like, if you want life wisdom, go talk to your grandparents. If you want your cell phone fixed, your app or your TV to work, or your computer, give it to your kids, right? And now I have kids, and I'll change the brakes on their car, but if I have something wrong with my phone, I'll hand it to my daughter or my son, and they fix it in 30 seconds. The generations that are entering the workforce are not lazy. And I really don't like when people say that. First, we raised them. Secondly, we taught them the skill sets and the work ethics that they have, but they bring to work a completely different set of expectations and baseline skills, which are more technological, from more like electronic technology, not so much mechanical building and construction. And so we have to start their path the minute they onboard with training immediately. Now, this leads to something I like to say a lot as a coach, and that is that people that train more win more. People that train less win less. You find me something that contradicts that, I would love to sit down and have a cup of coffee and look into it. So we have to figure out why people don't want to get into this industry. People say that we respect it all the time, and yet they don't encourage their own children to get into it. And so I think we need to make this industry more attractive. And I'll pose a question to everyone on here watching this. I'll paint a scenario, circumstance. So if you have 10 companies, and each company has allowed to have one person at a table in a room, so there's 10 tables in an empty room, 10 representatives from 10 different companies. One prospective employee comes into that room. Why would they want to work for you? Specifically, other than you're getting paid and you have a job. Why would they want to work where you are? And if you don't really have a solid answer, you can't communicate one to the prospective employee. So we have to know exactly why people want to work for us and what we're going to provide for them. And the most common thing that people really look for, hands down, is the environment. The way you talk to me, treat me, respect me, And don't just claim that you show me respect. You have to actually do it through behavior and deeds. And that's number one. Pay is not even in the top five. It's no one will turn down higher pay, but what people really want is to be treated like a human being and respected and included for what they're doing.
Do you think that the industry has traditionally struggled with paying sort of the proper heed and respect to the service teams?
I do, and I think a big part of it is not so much that the people in the office don't actually respect them. It's just that the way people in the field feel respect is very different than the way people in the office perceive it's delivered. So, for example, you know what I mean? Like, I'll give you an example. Here's another example. It's like if you are ever in the position in life where you get to have your own home built, or your own, let's just say, home, right, or a building, and you're very excited, and you go to the house and you see the slab poured and you see the framing go up, and then one day you go and you see four people on top and they're passing around a hammer. And one person puts a nail in the frame, they pass the hammer to the next person, they pass the box of nails, and that person does it, and they pass it around. We do that with tools and equipment on site. You have one set of gauges, four technicians. Don't build a house with one hammer. Everybody needs a whole set of tools. And if you're short staffed, take whatever you would lose in payroll or you're not paying in payroll and put it towards resources to help the technician be able to perform better in the field. Having the tools that they need, and not the cheapest tools you can find, ones that are decent, that work, that are actually helpful, and then most of the times that's a lot of technology. That's going to be a show of respect instead of just telling the person verbally that you respect them. And I think it's simple things like that. The connection between the field and the office has to be one where both parties say, not only do I have sympathy, but empathy, right? And I understand what it's like to be you. Or, you know what, I didn't know, I'm a little embarrassed. All I can do is give you what you need now and say I'm sorry. But going forward, we could at least work together a little bit better. And I also have another rule: no more pizza for lunch. I can't stress that enough. Like,
What?
I'm just saying.
No more pizza.
You know, I got to tell you.
What about the ones with the cauliflower crust? If we're worried about waistlines, can we go cauliflower crust
I mean,
or no?
if you're a
Just
cauliflower
flat out.
crust kind of guy, you know, I mean, more power to you. But
What's wrong with pizza?
It's interesting because I'll give you an example. I travel, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 weeks a year. 9 out of 10 times I speak at a conference. You go to one side of the conference, they have sandwiches, meals, coffee, desserts. It's like this extravagant meal. And then you go to the other room and it's 45 boxes of $5 pizza. And it's like completely the norm. And the other thing is, if you're sending people to training, it puts them to sleep, right? And that's really what it is. But what's interesting is, you know, I hear from the field, and I don't have the luxury of consequence over people's jobs. So if I'm in the field and I keep hearing these things from technicians, chances are they're pretty important to management. But management usually, not usually, sometimes won't listen. Sometimes they do. There's some wonderful people in management. And I don't want anyone watching this to think I think otherwise. But I do know what the grudges are in the field, right? Where the points of frustration are. And if you want realistic results, you have to show respect, and you have to have realistic resources, realistic timeframes, and realistic skill sets. And if you don't have realistic skill sets, you have to have realistic training. And one of the things I've learned as a consultant, much to my surprise, out of all of the service industries, there's not a single segment that trains less than multifamily. Not one.
Yeah, I believe that. And considering that oftentimes, and I'm sure you probably have this statistic at the tip of your fingers, but the you know, at least the number one or sometimes number two reason for residents deciding to terminate a lease is because of the experience they're having with their service technician. Or said another way, service technicians have the biggest impact on retention. And so I talk a little about the training that you should be providing to service technicians to make sure that that interaction is also as positive as it can be, and also to give your technicians the tools to deal with conflict, because they will walk. We talked about domestic, violence situations. Like, they will walk into these things, and I think you probably need to gird these folks with the tools to deal with that too.
You do. And so there's a few things. So if you look at it from a company perspective, what most companies want: fair housing, sexual harassment, customer service. They all focus on liability-based training. Technicians suffer through that. I don't know very many people like, I can't wait to go to my 15th fair housing course. Now, it's important and you have to do it, but what the technicians want are skill-based training. They want to learn electrical troubleshooting. Just because they've been doing it for 30 years doesn't mean that they know what they're doing. And I've learned this with contractors too. And and I want to support both sides of this. The technicians in the field need electrical training. Most HVAC service calls are electrical troubleshooting. Most appliance repairs, electrical troubleshooting. All electrical repairs, electrical troubleshooting. So the skill part, I would start there. The other part is the interpersonal soft skills, the EQ, which is the only quotient that you can grow and improve. And that is why very often people that get promoted, especially in service industries, are not the best at fixing everything. They're the best at orchestrating a group of people that can fix things. And I'll give you an analogy in any kind of sports team, and I don't use a lot, but the captain of the team is rarely the most skilled on the team. They're the best person to and for the team. And it's the same thing with service departments. But de-escalation and social skills is just as important as the technical skills. And your mindset is just as important as your skill set, because your mind is something that possesses skills that either get developed or decline. And you have to make sure that you're constantly pouring into that and that you're growing seeds, not weeds. And you have to pour into the things that you want to grow and stop putting attention on the things that you want to extinguish and go away.
Yeah. Yeah, great advice. So this all speaks to retention, how you retain. Is there any, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any magic bullet for recruiting? Is there any great source? Like, where can people go to find potential prospects to serve as a technician?
Okay, so two things. I would like to mention pay just generally, and then I'll move into where to find them. So on average, I'll give you an example. The average starting pay for Starbucks is $15 to $17 an hour, right? Depends where you are in the country, what the season is. So do you want to work in the AC for $15 to $17 an hour, or on the AC outside in the heat for $15 to $17 an hour? So we can start there. By and large, the multifamily starting pay for a novice technician is around 20 to 25% lower than individual trades. So I would start there. The second part of that is just ask yourself, and you know what, if anyone on this that watches wants a list, I'll send you one. But ask yourself this question: what other trades and industries are around us within a 10-mile radius that we might be able to attract talent from? Manufacturing, landscaping, masonry, carpentry, roofing, building, asphalt, masonry work, landscaping. I mean, there's just so many. But here's the thing: if the pay is equal or even close, they're going for the environment. And the environment has to be conducive to their success. And they want you to take their success as seriously and as importantly as you take your own. And so you can look for all of the other industries, but at the end of the day, what's going to cause people to stay, just like residents, is the relationship between the people that see each other on a regular basis. And that's why maintenance is the key to longevity in residence and retention, because if the office sells a certain level of service, it needs to be delivered. And otherwise, they're going to be frustrated and find a better relationship. And it's the same thing with employees.
Yep. Yep. That makes sense. Anything else on the best practices to retain great technicians? Anything else we haven't touched on yet? Because I know this is so important in a market like this.
Yeah, I could talk about this for days. The biggest thing is really just to understand, from their perspective, and when I say theirs, I mean the technicians, how are they treated? Are people treated well enough that they would, in your absence, tell their friends and family, you should get into this industry? And I think that alone, if you could just answer that question and deep down say yes, I think that'd be great. When you're hiring people, ask yourself this, and one of the most important questions: is the person coachable? Are they mentally flexible and willing to change their behavior? And, do I really want this temperament representing my team? And the other thing is, have you ever really thought to yourself as a manager, service manager, supervisor, am I really good to work for or good to work with? Am I easy to work with? And, so the best practice is Or people are going to know whether you set them up for success. For training, the minimum that I recommend for a technician is 80 hours a year. 80. Uh, Most of the service industries train somewhere between 1 and 300 hours a year per technician.
So, Mark, I guess is the problem in achieving that, and I don't disagree. I mean, that sounds wonderful. Um, the problem is that individual properties, right? So the way the industry is structured, of course, these are technically usually employees of the property, right? And the property themselves, each property, unless it's a large asset, 300, 400 units, does not typically have room in its budget to pay for 80 hours of training, right? So then that falls on the management company, has to take that role and do the training. But the margins for management companies are super thin. Having been there, I can tell you, it's very hard to afford a training department. So I've always felt personally like you couldn't really do a great job at training where you had a full-time head of training within your department and then the budget to pay to send people to training or whatever the case may be until you were at, I don't know, 15,000 units, something like that. That's when you start to see, what do you do? How do you manage that when you're a smaller company?
Yeah, so something that I've seen small companies do, and I know it's not easy. I mean, we say this like everybody should just be able to do it, and that's just not the case. But you can get together with several owners. Like, say you have 3,000 units. You're doing the best you can, and you're like, man, we just don't have the resources. Get 3 or 4 other owners and hold a joint event and have people
Have
do
you
that.
seen that happen?
Oh, yeah, all the time. And what will happen is someone has 500 units. They have a mixed asset types. They have multifamily and single family together, and they're like this upstart company, and they're like, to them they're big and they're 2,000 units. Get together with a few other owners. Most of the owners usually know they have peers, right? And so I see that often happen, and it's very successful. They just have to plan for it, and they have to be able to work together, because that sounds like a good idea. But I think we've all been to dinner with that group of friends where one just doesn't pay their share, right? And you have to, it's like pulling teeth to get it out of them. And so you have to make sure, but you can do that. And a lot of the vendors will do things, there's online training. Any training is better than none, as long as the training is correct and skillful.
How about the apartment associations, Mark? The local associations from the NAA, are they helpful in this respect, or do they not offer the kind of training that you're talking about?
Some do, and so they can be very helpful. It just depends on really the belief of the person that's in that program and in that position. A lot of times the smaller associations are very connected with the field because that's really their only resource for management. And so they will build relationships with the maintenance technicians, and I think that they could go. And you have to ask yourself this question too. What costs me more at the end of the year? $300 and a day off of work for training? Or I save $300 and you're here during service requests and now I have a lawsuit. And so, it's easy to justify either way. The cost analysis I typically use is payroll, right? So let's say if you just calculate the time that you would pay in payroll, their production loss for being gone, and the cost of the class, does that outweigh any of the benefits? And it's very rare that it does. But I would work with some of the associations, the vendors, and other owners and peer groups.
Great, great. And if you don't have an owner, if you're a third-party manager, you don't have an owner that's supporting this, find a different owner, because they're ultimately costing you problems at the end of the day, because you won't be able to retain good people. Which is difficult. It's difficult enough managing properties without having churn.
It's tough, and I think most people are agree to this. Not every customer is for you. Sometimes you have to decide not to take on a customer. Sometimes you have to fire a customer. Sometimes you're better off not approving someone for something. And so there's a lot of wisdom in that too, is knowing who to work with when you have the luxury of doing so.
Mark, if people want to learn more, they want to talk to you personally about some of these things, engage you, how do they find you?
They can just search Service Team Training, so serviceteamtraining.com, or just markcukro.com. And if anyone on this call wants any of the information that we discussed, it's my pleasure to send it to you to forward to them. You could have had anyone on this, and I appreciate being invited, and I appreciate people spending their time watching this. And it's my sincerest goal is to help operators of all sizes do a little bit better on their day-to-day operations. And so I hope somebody got something out of this.
Yeah, no, I think there was some good stuff delivered today, and yeah, it's not an easy industry. I think the more we can share with folks in terms of best practices, even in the limited time that we have here, I think is good for everyone. So I appreciate you willing to come on and share some of your wisdom, your 19 years of wisdom earned over the +1. Thanks so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at this week's episode of the Apartment Academy podcast. The Apartment Academy is a production of Leonardo 24/7, the industry's leader in multifamily operations and maintenance software. At Apartment Academy, we realize the hard work that goes into property management and the stress that comes along with it. Leonardo 24/7 takes the guesswork out of your team's day-to-day by providing customized daily guidance on tasks that need to be done, guaranteeing consistent operations across your entire portfolio. To learn more, visit www.leonardo247.com today.